Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm John Hillman, Director of the Reconnecting Asia project at CSIS. We've got an impressive set of experts joining us today for a conversation about the future of subsea cables, and I'm eager to get that conversation started. But just briefly, let me provide a bit of context about why we recently published a report called Securing the Subsea Network. It sounds like a somewhat obscure issue, but I've come to learn, and I've come to believe actually, that these systems are among the most economically important, least understood projects in the world. Subsea cables carry the vast majority of international data. Our financial system depends on them, as do our diplomats and military personnel operating overseas. And many of us have become even more dependent on these systems during the pandemic and an unprecedented shift to doing really everything online, whether it's work and school, shopping, medical appointments, keeping in touch with family and friends. And subsea cables are so important, but like other types of digital infrastructure, they're often out of sight and out of mind. And to some extent, US policymakers haven't had to think too much about these systems. That's also partially because the United States enjoys unique advantages in global networks due to its advantages as a first mover in this area, its innovative companies, and its historical openness to global connections. But as we'll discuss today, this landscape is changing. New players have emerged as leading investors, builders, and operators. China's rise in this space has been rapid, and US policymakers, as well as policymakers in allied countries, are grappling with some new challenges. The goal of this recent report, which you can find online at csis.org, is to help explain the basics, how these systems work, what US interests are at stake, and where policymakers should start focusing their attention as they craft a response. And so we're going to dive into some of that in just a moment. But before we do, let me also thank the sponsors whose support made this event possible: Sienna Communications, Corning, Google, Microsoft, and NEC. And now I'd like to introduce our three experts and get the conversation started. Vinton Cerf is Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, where he is responsible for identifying new enabling technologies to support the development of advanced internet-based products and services from Google. He is widely known for his work as co-inventor of TCP/IP, the protocol that laid the foundation for the internet. Catherine Creese is Director of the US Naval Seafloor Cable Protection Office. She has over 2 decades of experience in the subsea cable industry, having also served with the US Coast Guard and worked in the private sector. She's also served as an executive member of the International Cable Protection Committee and as a representative to the North American Submarine Cable Association. And finally, Lieutenant General Bill Mayville is the former commanding general of the US Army's 1st Infantry Division, Director of Operations for the Joint Chiefs Staff, and Vice Commander of US Cyber Command. During his distinguished military career, he deployed to Operation Enduring Freedom and commanded coalition operations in Regional Command East. So Vint, let me start with you. You helped create a framework for the internet that has remained, by many measures, remarkably consistent for nearly half a century. And I think it's important to understanding how data moves in the real world. So if you could help us just get started here, what are some of the tenets behind that framework, and what, if any, sources of stress do you see today?
Well, this is sort of like describe 3 universes in 25 words or less. First of all, thank you very much for having me on the show. Second, congratulations on a really good report. I read it again this morning. It's not very long, 15 pages or so, well worth the time. So congratulations on terse presentation there, substantive. With regard to Internet's architecture, one of the most critical things is that the Internet protocol layer, this is a layer cake. The Internet protocol layer is sort of the place where the, we'll call it electronic postcards go. And they have two properties. They have no idea what they're carrying, just a bag of bits. They don't know what they mean. And they have no idea how they're being carried, just like a postcard doesn't know whether it went on a car or a plane or a rucksack on the back of the bicycle. And that turns out to be important because when we did the design in 1973, we knew that there would be new technologies coming along. We didn't want the internet protocol, fundamental, waste of the protocol stack, to be too knowledgeable about the underlying transport technology, so that if we added a new transport technology, you didn't have to change the architecture. So it has not changed in that respect, literally, since the first detailed design was done in 1973 and 74. If there are any stress points at all, it's simply the massive demand for increased capacity, which is showing up partly thanks to the pandemic and also partly thanks to entertainment habits, where people are watching streaming video now more than they ever watched conventional broadcast or even cable television. And so that plus this kind of interaction, plus an increasing demand from devices that we'll call Internet of Things, those programmable appliances that can touch the internet and interact with it, report data, or get commands back. All of that in the many tens of billions will also demand capacity. So at this point, there can be no doubt in my mind that the undersea cable capacity is vital to the success of anything that depends on the internet. The low Earth orbiting satellites notwithstanding, just in terms of raw capacity. And so their safety and security is vital to everything that depends on it.
Thank you. And so I think one of the trends you're pointing toward there is really just surging demand. And Catherine, I want to go to you next. As we're thinking about, as demand is rising, I think one of the other trends that we uncovered in this report, as we were talking to people from both industry and government, is that it's becoming, in some respects, more difficult to get these systems planned and to deliver them in a timely manner. Catherine, I know you served on a council that advised the FCC on improving that cable planning and protection process. And so I was hoping, could you say a bit about the challenges that group highlighted and some of its recommendations? And I think thanks.
Thank you for inviting me here. Sorry about that. And I just wanted to take a moment to note that anything I say is my opinion, not the opinion of my agency. We're in a US agency. So yeah, there were a series of challenges that we figured out. And they kind of center around a lack of a coordinated response by the government to applications for new cables, which include, not having really a central starting point, poor cooperation between agencies at different levels of government and within the federal government. And while the federal government correctly categorizes submarine cables as critical infrastructure, the processes and regulations that determine the speed of deployment and the ability to operate and maintain these systems don't really reflect that importance.
And I think one of the recommendations that I think we sort of were inspired by that group's work is this idea of having a more centralized point of contact. Is that something you could say a bit more about? Just what it's like, to all the various groups involved, levels of approval. Why would having a single point of contact make things easier?
Yeah, certainly. There's basically the local level, the state level, to some extent, some regional things that are federal, and then the FCC. And there's no one. If a novice wants to come in and build a new cable, there is no federal regulation that says where you need to go to get a permit. Every Army Corps office has their state federal regulations that they permit under, but each regional office works differently. So it takes a lot of of effort to go to all of the various jurisdictions and to each of the offices that may be consulting or may be providing a permit for this. And there's no central guidance. And projects can get stuck between one agency puts one type of a time requirement. For instance, you can only work during specific times of the year for a natural cause, like turtles nesting or some type of a migration. And another agency says, well, you can't work during those time frames because we have these other activities going on. And there's no one who can take an overarching look and say, well, look, this is critical infrastructure, and we need to figure out a time that is workable for all the parties involved. And it's difficult to sort out those types of disagreements and conflicts between agencies without a single point.
Thanks. And I do want to return to that set of environmental challenges a bit later. Bill, I'm hoping you can help us step back here and put the strategic stakes here into context. One of the core U.S. interests that we highlight in this report is that the U.S. government also relies on subsea cables for its communications abroad. You've commanded troops overseas. Could you help us understand the value and the importance of these systems for U.S. personnel who are actually on the ground?
Yeah, I sure can, John. Thank you again for the opportunity to participate. And let me also echo Vince's comments about the CSIS report. I think it's an excellent primer and one I would encourage everyone to read.
Thanks so much. And I think your camera might be off if that's unintentional, if you could turn that back on. That's great. Thanks so much.
So let's see here. Am I back on or off?
You're off now.
Okay.
You were just on.
Well, let me just then say that, the problem we have right now is that this is probably the least understood national security threat that I think is out there. I'm going to just kind of read through some of my notes here. Give me a second. 95% of the internet is transmitted through subsea cables. I was reading today now the Fed acknowledges that there's some 10 million trillion a day in transactions. So then we should also remember the days of 9/11. What does that mean? Wall Street was shut down while the capital was waiting for capital flow back into the markets. And the New York City telecommunication infrastructure had suffered, significant damages, and we all stood waiting. So everyone is reliant on the internet on a daily basis, and that includes your military. Our capabilities to project national power and to sustain it presumes access to these cables, and without it, we would see degradations in our over-horizon support, our global logistics, our ISR, intelligence support, our medical support, our global synchronization of combat capabilities, our coordination with allies and partners. And while I want people to appreciate that America's military communication systems are quite robust and they're designed to be resilient under attack, the pace and cadence of operations for the modern systems that we use would be significantly impacted if we were to lose access to the undersea cable networks. And so without these subsea cables, warfare would be more expeditionary, would incur higher levels of risk and more casualties. And if you look at the requirements for military modernization, you see that the military is placing a premium on accessing large data and leveraging cloud technology, 5G and applied AI. And it envisions a data-rich operations occurring much deeper in the formations of the fighting force, making the cables really an essential part of our critical infrastructure. And the cloud is really nothing more than switches and servers, and it's linked by wires and ultimately cables. But it's choked into a couple hundred cables that lie on the ocean floor. And so with 5G and millimeter wave technology, the internet's becoming even faster, and it will enable higher amounts of data to be sent and received. And consequently, more devices will be connected to the internet, not less. So this generates yet more data, which requires an even greater reliance on undersea cables to move that data. And the satellites can really only process a limited amount of the data we use, but the cables provide a cheaper alternative to push data faster and with more fidelity. For example, the modern undersea cables we use right now are fiber optic technology. So we're pushing data at the speed of light. And it is quite preferable to satellite feeds. So I'll come back to you visually. I wanted to make sure I got these points out to you, and I will come back to you in the real world here. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much. And I mean, I see sort of a theme there emerging just about how, our expectations about demand are going to increase as, the technology around us continues to change. And so you mentioned that this is a national security issue. And I think it's one that has been getting more attention in recent years. And Vint, I'd like to just ask you about this, your reaction to some of these security concerns. I think some policymakers have been more concerned about data security of these systems, and especially the risk that foreign adversaries might get access to sensitive information. So how do you react to that? How do you think about those risks?
So like every good graduate student, I'm going to take your question and distort it around so I can answer it. It's a classic tactic. Actually, also, I just want to make a few points, just like General Mayville did. First point is that why do we build cables? We're at Google. We build our own cables now, partly because we can afford it now. But we do it because we absolutely have to have the capacity to link things between our data centers, which are scattered around the world. And the reason we need to do that is we copy the data back and forth in order to make sure that even if a data center goes away, no one loses any data. So we need lots of capacity for that. Second, we have to connect to the public internet in order to interact with our customers and users. And so again, increased amounts of capacity to deal with what they're looking for. We also need to provide capacity for content distribution, and other companies like Akamai and the other cloud providers similarly are situating facilities local near to the users, but they have to be able to deliver the content to the distribution networks. And again, undersea cable is vital to all of that. With regard to security and safety, plainly, we are all at risk with regard to physical cable interruptions. And there are some terrible stories. I'm sure General Mayville can tell a bunch, and so can Catherine, about inadvertent cutting of cables causing substantial problems economically and from the national security point of view. I think of the Eastern Mediterranean, especially where 3 cables got cut, and there wasn't adequate satellite capacity to recover, and there was a lot of damage done as a result of that. One thing that we've tried to do at Google, after realizing the potential hazards of snooping on cable, was to introduce cryptography in a wide range of the parts of the architecture of the internet. So we've got low-level IPsec end-to-end cryptography available. We've got cryptography end-to-end at the transport layers. We have other new protocols like QUIC that introduce crypto for protection in transit. We encrypt data while it's at rest in our data centers. There are other elements of the system of the internet's architecture that depend very heavily on crypto, like the domain name system security techniques, or RPKI for routing security, two-factor authentication, which uses public key crypto. We've taken the view, frankly, that all networks, including our own, have been penetrated and are at risk, and therefore we make heavy use of cryptographic methods in order to protect the data, regardless of who has access to the photons that are flowing through the network. So we're heavy users of cryptography and redundancy in order to protect ourselves from loss. I do have to tell you one other thing. This is a bar bet. If somebody says to you, you can't double the speed of light, and you might say, well, actually, we almost can. And with optical fiber, as I think all of you know, the propagation rate of light through glass is less than it is through a vacuum. If you had a hollow fiber, you would actually get like a 50% increase in the speed with which the photons can move. And so there is a group called Air Guide at the University of Southampton that is developing a technology for creating hollow fiber. And you transmit the data through the center of the fiber. And so you can almost win a bar bet on that one, because most people would say, well, of course you can't double the speed of light. Physically impossible. So in case nobody gets anything else out of today's discussion, you got at least one bar bet.
There you go.
Catherine, I want to turn to you as we're talking about some of these threats that cables face. I think one of the surprising things to those of us who, at least, my initial knowledge of this was sort of from Hollywood movies, and in the sort of popular imagination, the threats to cables are sharks and submarines. The data on cable faults would suggest something different. Could you tell us a little bit about what are the common threats these cables face, and what, if any, sort of measures we should be considering to help reduce those threats? And if you could unmute. Thanks.
Sorry about that. The sharks are the ones that get all the glory, but usually it's the guy with the clam dredge. So the majority of faults are really unintentional faults, from anchoring, from fishing. There was a series of faults off of the coast of another country some years ago, and companies were able to determine, through use of the automated identification system and some other techniques, that these were small freighters that were actually dragging their anchors, and they didn't know they were dragging their anchors. But it did a lot of damage and caused a lot of harm. And so the cable companies went to the ship owners, and the ship owners were like, sorry, well, we got no money. So then the cable owners went to the insurance companies. And with that, they were able to get some leverage, not to put the ships out of business and not to take the captain's livelihoods away, but to educate them on how to properly store their anchors so that they don't accidentally cause damage. So yeah, anchoring, fishing, and these sometimes can be reduced by ensuring that your cable is charted properly, and then these cable awareness campaigns that owners can undertake to take information to the fishermen and say, this is where our cable is, this is how you act when you're near it. And then sometimes the economic pressures through the ownership, through actually threats of recovering financial damages from one party or another. And then really a good way of preventing faults is proactively, before the cable is built, let the cable owners find the safest places to put their cables, so they're not in lower likelihood of getting damage from fishing and anchoring and new construction and these other causes. And so really you could say that one of the best means of cable protection is through this permitting and regulation of how the cable is designed. But this, tying back to what Vint was saying, this really does, though, make you take a balance of what is the risk from unintentional damage, which is where the vast majority of damage comes, or what is the risk from nefarious damage? Is somebody gonna, dig it up intentionally? And through the last 150 years of cable construction, it's been almost exclusively accidental damage, but there is still a balance that the government and regulators and cable owners, frankly, need to weigh each time. How much data do you publish, who do you publish it to, and how do you do that in a way that won't encourage someone to have a bad idea, nefarious action.
So this is an issue that's also, it's been interesting to see that it's been getting more attention from US allies as well. The United States for the last several years has been talking about wanting to cooperate with partners and allies and provide high quality infrastructure. And it's interesting that one of the few examples of the US working with Australia and Japan is actually a subsea cable going to the Pacific island nation of Palau that's planned. So it's sort of I think an indication there that these governments are sort of in alignment on the importance of providing alternatives. And so, Bill, I wanted to ask you, again, thinking about there's an economic dimension to this, but there's also a security dimension. With China's rise in this space as a provider of digital infrastructure, how important is it to be offering these alternatives to developing countries?
I think it's very important. I mean, how comfortable are we having our access to internet depend on a neighbor we can't trust? Just looking at the Chinese growth in this market area, I think between 2012 and 2017, they were about, in terms of the global cable projects, they were only about 7%, but by the end of 2019, they're up to 11%. And a report I read just recently suggests that they'll be up to grow to about 20% in the second half of this decade. So the submarine or subsea communications market is growing. And you're right, the transatlantic market has maybe kind of leveled off, but where the real growth right now is projected to be in Asia to Europe, intra-Asia, and then the trans-Pacific markets themselves. More specific to your question, one of the areas that really concerns me is the Chinese military doctrine that we see being developed by the PLA that views future warfare as a confrontation of systems. And so in this framework, the warfare is waged not only in the traditional domains of land, sea, and air, but also in space, cyberspace, in the electromagnetic space, and in information warfare. The theory is, and it's just emerging, as some of this is really quite aspirational, but it does show you where they're going. The theory is that by threatening the operational systems that enable an enemy's ability to fight in the traditional domains of warfare, the enemy will lose its ability, its will, its capabilities to resist. And again, I think this right now is somewhat aspirational, excuse me. But you can see where China's going. And even if they don't completely succeed in developing robust capabilities to achieve this type of warfare, they will be able to expand the gray zone, if you will, of future conflict. And I think, that area of greatest ambiguity, and I would argue the area where the consequences, if you get it wrong, could be quite severe. So we're now talking about viewing subsea cables as critical infrastructure, like something in a domain that enables us to project power, to connect with allies. And now China can develop through its commercial enterprises levers to threaten escalation, or can in some time maybe hold things that we value at risk. And that's very concerning. And it's in their documents. It is in their thinking, and they are headed in that direction.
And I think these are obviously very consequential decisions for smaller developing economies who, might not have as many cables. Sometimes these offers come with financing, so it can be upfront, somewhat attractive. Vin, I saw you raise your hand here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted, first of all, I agree with Bill's general analysis. One thing I will say, however, is that it's inescapable that the Chinese will introduce their technology into the telecommunications environment. They're doing it with 5G, they're doing it with cable, they're doing it with Huawei routers and ZTE and so on. So that's inescapable, and it's incumbent on those of us who are heavily dependent on internet, and that's increasingly all of us, to design and build systems that are resilient in the face of the potential threats. I'd also like to point out that unlike the situation with nuclear war or mutually assured destruction, it's possible that we could argue for mutually assured benefit. And at some point, the Chinese will discover they are as dependent as the rest of us are on this connectivity, and it's not in their best interest to either threaten or otherwise undermine the connectivity that's been built. I know that sounds a little Pollyanna, but I believe we should use our ability to argue in the economic space that they should rethink their policy if it turns out to be demonstrably damaging to their own interests.
Vin, I want to stay with you here for one more question, and then I think we're going to go to the audience for Q&A. And so for our viewers, you can submit a question on the same page that you registered for the event, or just go to csis.org and click on events, and then you'll be able to find this one, submit a question that way. So Vin, I think there's been a lot of, you touched on this a little bit earlier, I think there's naturally been a lot of attention to the physical security of cables. I think maybe we're drawn to that as we're thinking about how they work and the potential vulnerabilities that they face. And so the physical security part is very important, but if the overall goal is data security, that's probably not the whole picture. And so what else do we need to be considering beyond this physical network layer?
Well, I'm going to make this part of my answer short because I mentioned a whole bunch of cryptographic techniques and things like that we already apply and are adding more techniques in order to increase the resilience of the system against various kinds of direct attack. But resilience is a consequence of having an abundance of connectivity. And so another reason for building more cable is to increase the redundancy of cable and also take advantage of things like the low Earth orbiting satellites that Elon Musk and others are putting up in order to make it really hard for somebody to deny access to internet services simply because you can't stop everything. So I think the correct answer to the question is apply cryptographic methods, strong authentication and the like, and also increase redundancy in order to create a highly resilient system.
Great, thank you. So let me go to our first question from the audience here. And General Mayville, I'm going to direct this to you for the first swing. So the question is, how has the expansion of Chinese and Russian military capabilities changed the US military's, or we could just say US government's, perception of threats to subsea cables? And in this set of activities too, how do we see the South China Sea changing as an environment through which cables pass? I think the implication being there, might we start to see cables going around that area? But how has the expansion of Chinese and Russian military capabilities affected our threat perception here?
Well, I think today just recently, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in testimony said that we now view China as the pacing threat. Russia is still a great power with tremendous capability, and we hold in check with our nuclear deterrence framework and as well as our alliance and participation in NATO. But I think the concern I see is a series of activities. So I see activity in space. We have seen already the use of surrogates in cyber, and it seems nothing checks that activity. So you see in two domains already, space and cyber, heavy participation, and you can see that what they're trying to do with that, why they would be there. If you've watched military operations over the last 2 or 3 decades, it is clear that what the joint force can do is project and sustain power off its coast, and it can do that at will. If you want to go after that without necessarily trying to compete in those domains, then you have to look at the things that enable it. And so by being in space, by weaponizing space, by doing what we've seen as a state-sponsored attacks or using surrogates in cyber, you can begin to see the beginnings of where they hope to dismantle our capabilities. Now throw into that investments in hypersonics, in long-range precision fires, and the standoff that we call A2AD. You see, in specifically to your question, within China, within the 9-dash line of the South China Sea, the building of infrastructure so that they can dominate that, and it's a submarine basket that will push us further. It is an attempt to push us further away and make it much more difficult for us to get a foothold. The last thing that you want to see, if you're China, is our ability to seize a foothold into that area, because they know that they can't stop the joint force capabilities, and that's true. The same thing on the plains of Europe. You don't want to see American forces with NATO there, because you won't be able to undo that. So you can begin to see an attempt to push at bay our capabilities, to, through economic levers, remove the number of allies and partners, or express consequence if smaller countries in the region reach out and work with the United States or its allies. You can see the investment in standoff weapon systems, and now put on top of that investments to hold the subsea cables at risk. I'll conclude just with one thought, and it's a little bit of a gentle pushback to what Vince said, and that is this idea that somehow economic interdependence will create opportunities to find a way to work this out. And I just would commend people to remember the great book, The Great Illusion by Norman Angell, who in 1909 talks as an economist who says, we are so economically interdependent there will never be a world war. And of course, a few short years later, there is not just one, but two. I don't think that level of interdependence is going to be enough to dissuade China. I think we need the presence of real capability, hard power, and leverage. And we need allies in the region, and we need to really look at how we secure or mitigate our vulnerabilities in these new domains, and basically take it away from China as a card they can play.
Catherine, I want to go to you with this next question from the audience. So the question is, what role do you see for navies in protecting submarine cables?
Well, in the case of the United States, there is a very clear legal separation between defense and law enforcement. And the defense does not do law enforcement. We're forbidden by law from doing that there. So there's no involvement during peace. Other countries treat it very differently. Countries put naval shipriders on installation vessels and repairs to monitor activities. And they have they can range up to fairly significant oversight and law enforcement roles. Some countries have even, a country recently has even, said they're going to build a vessel to do oversight of their cables. But in the US, we don't do that. So for instance, my role with commercial cables is quite limited to advisory levels.
Thank you. So we've got a question here, and Vin, I'm going to go to you with this one. We were talking before this program started about cryptography and the history of cryptography in the United States. And the question here is, how might advances in quantum computing impact the security of cryptographic tools?
So the good news is that the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and of course the National Security Agency, are well along in dealing with this problem. The issue here has to do with quantum cryptography and the use of a particular algorithm to break existing cryptographic methods that rely on the analysis of the, what do I want to say? Damn, I forget the word I'm looking for, is just gone out of my head. Factorization. The factorization of the product of large primes is a hard mathematical problem. It turns out that quantum computing can break that pretty quickly. The good news is that 36 algorithms that are not subject to that weakness have already been presented to NIST. They've narrowed it down to at least 18, and I think it's going to come down to half of that this year. So we're well on our way to new algorithms that are not subject to that weakness. On top of which, the existing quantum computing capability, including our own at Google, is not really ready to introduce any kind of crypto breaking capability. So the maturity of quantum is not yet a threat, and we're already ahead of the game when it comes to new algorithms.
Great. Catherine, let me go back to you with this question. General Mayville, welcome any thoughts that you have on this as well. So this is talking about building capacity for partner governments. I think primarily developing and emerging economies. What needs to be done to raise awareness of these security risks, and what should be done in terms of making sure that trusted systems are used? Is there a role there for the United States to play? I think a lot of the sort of recent U.S. government attention has been, frankly, focused on domestic steps and sort of screening of cable applications. But there's the other side of the cable, and there's, I think, a case here for what should the government, U.S. government, State Department, for example, be doing to improve the foreign environment for these cables?
Well, I can't speak for the State Department, but in my opinion, the things that they're currently doing, there's some level of risk sharing that they can do. If we know about particular nefarious activities, then it's important to let the people that are regulating the other ends of the cables that connect us know of those same things, and sharing our recommendations for suppliers. I think one of the probably more persuasive things that we can do is simply say, if there's X content or X vulnerability baked into a particular cable system, we're not going to allow it to land in the United States. But I think probably diplomatically, there's a limit to how much intelligence can be shared. But there's a lot of information that I think exists below that limit that should be done by State Department. My understanding is they're taking actions there.
Yeah, let me first dispel two crutches to the argument. First, that somehow through technology we're going to work our way out and there'll be a technological solution to our exposure to these vulnerabilities. I don't see that happening. I think space-based systems, for example, are improving. But so it's the growth of big data, and it's going to be hard to exploit data for commercial value or public utility, or for that matter, for military operations without the underlying dependencies on subsea cables. So that's one piece. I think the other piece that is out there is that I think that there's a big role for government that to play here. We can't leave. While we look to industry for the innovations and improvements in this market and these capabilities, it's really government that can come in and play a central role in incentivizing, whether it's commercial IRAD or RDT&E investments, or even creating public-private partnerships to guarantee services and assure integrity of the cables themselves. And as Catherine alluded to, there's an echelon both at the local, state, and federal that needs to be coordinated. But I also think there's an international play that we need to think through. And here I think we can be leaders in this area and we should step up. But this is critical infrastructure for the United States, but it is also critical infrastructure for its partners and its allies in the world. And so if we, the United States, can only protect one side of the cable landing station. And we can't leave it to content providers or consortium of telecoms who have contractual arrangements in that space to be able to assure the national security requirements or the implications in that space. So I think government has a key role to play. I think we have an advantage in this regard because we enjoy some very critical partners and some very important alliances that we need to be leveraging in the space to get after this.
So we're out of time here. Vint, if you've got any sort of final reaction to that, I'd welcome that. if we could keep it brief.
Well, just one brief response to what General Mayville said, and that is that one of the most important things we have to remember is that, at least from the internet point of view, is that this layered architecture is our friend here. We are not totally dependent solely on the mechanisms in the lowest layers for protecting the system. And so redundancy, resiliency, cryptography, and the like all contribute to the ability to resist the side effects of people tearing up cable or even surveilling them. So we shouldn't be imagining that we are only and solely dependent on the physical infrastructure for protection.
Thanks. So this has been a fascinating discussion. Let me thank our experts for joining us, Vint, Catherine, General Mayville. Thanks so much for being with us. And thank you also to the audience for submitting smart questions. It doesn't always happen. We got some really great questions. And thank you for joining us. Please, if you haven't, check out the report. It's on csis.org, and we'll look forward to welcoming you back another time. Thanks.